My son and his wife saw me as a grieving widow, a fragile little bird with a broken wing, easily managed and set aside. What they didn't know was that my husband, Arthur, had left me with more than just memories. He left me with a fortune they couldn't imagine, 2 hidden properties, and one very specific, ironclad instruction. So when they took me to that fancy steakhouse dinner, sliding legal papers across the table to manage my affairs, I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just smiled and reached into my handbag. Want to find out what was on that piece of paper? Follow my story to see how a quiet inheritance becomes a quiet revenge. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a chapter. Smash that like button if you're ready for the drama. And comment below with what you think will happen next. The house smelled of dying flowers and leftover casserole. It had been a week since we buried Arthur, and the scent of public grief was beginning to sour. Sympathy cards crowded the mantelpiece, their cursive condolences blurring into a single, meaningless platitude. My son, Ethan, and his wife, Jessica, moved through the space with an efficiency that felt less like care and more like an audit. "Mom, have you eaten?" Jessica asked, her voice a little too bright as she collected a wilting lily arrangement from the coffee table. "I can heat up some of the lasagna from next door." "I'm fine, dear. Just tired," I murmured from Arthur's favorite armchair. The worn leather still held the faint, familiar scent of his sandalwood aftershave and pipe tobacco. I closed my eyes, trying to hold on to it, but the aggressive scent of lemon cleaner from Jessica's whirlwind activity was winning the battle. Ethan came over and fluffed the pillow behind my head, a gesture he must have thought was comforting. To me it felt like being managed. "We're just worried about you, Mom," he said, his hand lingering on my shoulder. "It's a big house. A lot to handle on your own." I offered a weak smile. "Your father and I managed for 40 years. "Yes, but Dad handled everything, didn't he?" Jessica chimed in from the kitchen. "The finances, the upkeep. We just want to make sure you're not overwhelmed." I looked at them, my handsome son, his face a softer echo of his father's, and his sharp, immaculately dressed wife. They saw a fragile widow, a woman lost in the fog of sorrow, someone who needed to be guided and protected. I let them see it. For now it was safer that way. Arthur was gone, and the silence he left behind was vast and terrifying. But in that silence, I was beginning to hear other things, like the quiet, persistent hum of my children's ambition. A few days later, I forced myself to begin the impossible task of sorting through Arthur's office. The room was the heart of our home, a testament to a life well lived and meticulously organized. I ran my hand over his heavy oak desk, expecting a wave of grief, but instead I felt a surge of purpose. This was his sanctuary, and I was its keeper. Tucked inside a leather-bound copy of Walden, I found a faded photograph from a trip to Maine nearly 20 years ago. In it, we're standing on a rocky shore, the wind whipping my hair across my face. Arthur has his arm wrapped tightly around me, his familiar, crinkling smile aimed not at the camera, but at me. The memory was so clear it hurt. We were sitting on that same coast a year ago, not long after his diagnosis. His voice was thinner then, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "You're stronger than anyone knows, Carolyn," he'd said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Even you." I had squeezed his hand. "We're strong together." He'd turned to me then, a sad, knowing look on his face. "I worry about Ethan," he confessed, his voice dropping. "He's a good man, but he has a soft spine where it counts. And that wife of his. Jessica sees life as a series of acquisitions. She doesn't understand that the best things, this view, our life, a good name, are earned, not taken." He coughed, a dry, rattling sound that tore at my heart. He took a breath and looked me square in the eyes. "When the time comes, promise me you'll read every single word, Carolyn. Trust my judgment. Trust yourself." Staring at the photograph in the silent office, his words echoed not as a memory, but as a directive. It was the first time I understood that Arthur hadn't just been preparing to die. He had been preparing me to live. The offices of Hayes, Donnelly, and Finch were exactly as I remembered them from years ago. Quiet, smelling of old paper and polished mahogany, a place where life's messy details were tamed into neat, legal order. Mr. Hayes, a kind man with Arthur's same salt and pepper hair and steady eyes, greeted me with a sad but gentle smile. "Carolyn, thank you for coming in. I know this is difficult." We sat in leather chairs that sighed under our weight. He didn't waste time with small talk. He opened a thick binder, the last will and testament of Arthur Adler. "Arthur was very specific," Mr. Hayes began, his voice soft. "He wanted to ensure you were secure, that you had absolute autonomy over your future." I steeled myself for the numbers. I knew Arthur had been a successful engineer and a prudent investor. I expected a comfortable pension, enough to live on without worry. I was not prepared for the reality. Beyond the primary residence, which is fully paid for, and his pension, Arthur's portfolio of stocks and investments is currently valued at just over $17 million. The number didn't compute. It was an abstraction, a sound without meaning. I must have looked pale because Mr. Hayes paused. $17 million, Carolyn. I shook my head slightly, trying to clear it. I had no idea. "He was a very shrewd man," Mr. Hayes said gently. "But that's not all. He also left you 2 other properties, both owned outright. A lakefront house on 5 acres in northern Minnesota, and a 2,000-acre working cattle ranch in Montana." My head was spinning. Lake house, ranch, sounded like a life belonging to someone else. Mr. Hayes continued, explaining that the will was ironclad. Everything was in my name, fully. There were no convoluted trusts for the children, no complex stipulations. Just me. My name over and over again. "He trusted you completely, Carolyn," Mr. Hayes finished, his gaze unwavering. "His primary instruction to me was to protect you, and by extension to protect his legacy through you." I thought of Ethan and Jessica, who believed I needed their help managing a modest pension. And in the quiet of that leather-bound room, I made a decision. I would say nothing. The days that followed the meeting with Mr. Hayes were a masterclass in passive-aggressive maneuvering from my children. Their concern intensified, their questions becoming more pointed. "Mom, I found a great service that helps seniors consolidate their accounts," Jessica said during a phone call, her voice dripping with artificial helpfulness. "It would make everything so much simpler to manage." "That's thoughtful, dear, but I think I'm all right for now," I replied, keeping my tone placid. Another day, Ethan stopped by with groceries I hadn't asked for. I found him in the living room, his eyes scanning the walls, the furniture, as if he were an appraiser. "You know, Mom, a house this size. The property taxes alone must be a fortune," he mused. "We just don't want you to be a target for scams or fall behind on things. People take advantage of widows all the time." The condescension was a dull, constant ache. They spoke to me in slow, simple sentences, as if my grief had also stolen 50 IQ points. They brought me pamphlets for active senior living communities and talked about the wisdom of downsizing. Every conversation was a gentle, insistent push towards relinquishing control, towards making myself smaller and more manageable for their sakes. Played my part. I was the confused, grieving mother. I'd sigh and say, "Oh, it's all so much to think about," or, "You're probably right, I should look at that later." I let them believe they were steering the ship, all while I held the map to a world they couldn't even imagine. The weight of my secret was immense, but the clarity it gave me was even greater. I saw them with a painful, perfect precision that only Arthur had seen before. The call came exactly 5 days after my visit to Mr. Hayes. It was Jessica. "Carolyn," she chirped, using my first name in a way she thought sounded modern and friendly, but which always felt dismissive. "Ethan and I want to take you out to a nice dinner tomorrow night. Or treat. Just to get you out of this dreary house for a bit." "That's very sweet of you, Jessica," I said, my voice perfectly even. I was sitting in Arthur's chair, holding a warm cup of tea. "Great. I made a reservation at the Gilded Steakhouse. And you know," she continued, her voice dropping into a more serious, confidential tone. "It's probably time we had a serious chat about the future. Just so we can get a plan in place to make things easier on you. Ethan has some papers he thinks you should look over." There it was. The gentle push had become a firm shove. The Gilded Steakhouse was where you went to close a deal. It was their chosen battlefield. The casual invitation, the mention of papers. It was all part of a carefully constructed plan to corner the grieving widow and have her sign her independence away between the appetizer and the main course. A strange, cold calm settled over me. There was no fear, no panic. Just a quiet, humming resolve. Arthur had prepared me for this. He had trusted me. I looked at the framed photo on the desk, the one of us on the coast of Maine. I would not fail him. "Yes, Jessica," I said, my voice steady. "Dinner sounds lovely." The Gilded Steakhouse was a cliché of dark wood, overstuffed leather booths, and dim lighting designed to make everyone look wealthier than they were. It was Jessica's choice, a place meant to impress and intimidate. We made awkward small talk over bread rolls and iced water, the tension a fourth unseen guest at our table. Finally, after the waiter took our order, Ethan cleared his throat and leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. "Mom," he began, his voice taking on a serious, practiced tone. "Jess and I have been doing a lot of thinking. We want to be proactive about your future. For your own good." Jessica reached across the table and patted my hand. "It's called legacy planning, Carolyn. It's what all smart families do. We've had a lawyer, a specialist in elder care, draw up some documents to streamline everything. It just makes sense." He slid a thick, pristine folder across the tablecloth. It looked heavy with legal clauses and stipulations. "This is a durable power of attorney and a document that transfers Dad's main assets into a trust that Jess and I can manage for you," Ethan explained. "It protects you and it simplifies everything. You won't have to worry about a thing. We'll take care of all of it." They both looked at me with bright, expectant eyes, a pair of hungry wolves disguised in cashmere. They saw this as the final, gentle step in a loving takeover. They saw it as their right. I looked from Ethan's earnest face to Jessica's perfectly painted smile. I looked at the formidable stack of papers meant to shrink my life into a manageable column on their spreadsheet. Then I let a small, real smile touch my own lips for the first time all evening. Seemed to confuse them. I took a slow sip of my water, set the glass down with a soft click, and completely ignored the folder they had presented. I did not get angry. I did not cry. I simply reached down into my simple leather handbag, the one Arthur had bought me for our 35th anniversary, and pulled out a single piece of paper. It was folded into quarters, a simple sheet of standard copy paper, softened at the creases from being in my bag for days. The sight of it, so flimsy and insignificant compared to their thick legal dossier, made them frown. "What's that, Mom?" Ethan asked, his voice laced with impatience. I didn't answer. I just continued to smile that quiet smile, the one I knew they couldn't decipher. With deliberate, unhurried movements, I unfolded the piece of paper and laid it flat on the white tablecloth, directly beside their folder. It was a photocopy, stark and black and white. I smoothed the single sheet with my fingers. "Your father, as you know, was a meticulous man," I said, my voice as calm as a placid lake. "He believed in planning for every contingency." I tapped a paragraph halfway down the page. "This is from his will. You should probably read it." Ethan and Jessica leaned forward, their heads nearly touching as they squinted in the dim light. I knew the words by heart. Addendum B. The caretaker clause. It is my express wish that my wife, Carolyn Adler, retain sole and absolute control over all assets bequeathed to her. As she was my partner in life, she is the sole executor of my legacy. Let it be known that any attempt by any party, including my direct issue, to coerce, manipulate, or otherwise unduly influence her financial decisions shall be interpreted as a violation of the spirit of this testament. Jessica looked up, her face a mask of confusion. "I don't understand. What does that mean?" "It means Arthur saw you coming," I said, my voice still soft. I then pulled out the second piece of paper I had brought, another folded sheet. This one was a copy of a handwritten letter. But he also left a personal note. To you, Ethan. I didn't need to read the whole thing, with its heartbreaking expressions of a father's disappointment. I just read the final damning sentence aloud into the stunned silence. She is not your responsibility to manage. She is your mother to love. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant clinking of silverware from other tables. The shock on their faces was absolute. It was Jessica who recovered first, her polite facade cracking and shattering like cheap veneer. "What is this?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "You've been playing us. Playing the poor, grieving widow." "I haven't been playing anyone," I replied calmly. "I've been grieving my husband. And respecting his wishes." Ethan finally found his voice, shaking his head in disbelief. Dad wouldn't do this to me. This is you. You manipulated him. Does that sound like the father you knew?" I asked, gesturing to the letter. The man who valued integrity above all else. The truth of it hit him, but instead of acceptance, it curdled into rage. "So what? You get everything. The money, the houses. What about me? I'm his son." His son, who was about to have his grieving mother sign away her life in a steakhouse. I corrected him gently. Jessica snatched her purse. "I can't believe this. You are a deceitful, manipulative old woman." She stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "Let's go, Ethan." He stared at me, his face a battleground of shame, anger, and wounded entitlement. He wanted to fight, to argue, but the words of his own father, written on that paper, had rendered him defenseless. He stood up, threw his napkin onto the table, and followed his wife. They left me there, alone in the leather booth, with their untouched legal documents and my two simple, powerful pieces of paper. The waiter approached my table with caution, asking if everything was all right. I assured him it was and asked him to box up my meal, suddenly feeling the deep, bone-weary exhaustion of the battle. I paid the bill and took a taxi home, watching the city lights smear across the window. Felt no triumph. Just a profound, hollow sadness for the family I had, and the family I had lost. I walked into the silent house, the scent of Arthur now barely a ghost. As I set my keys down, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Ethan. Then another from Jessica. I didn't need to read them. I could feel the heat of their fury, the torrent of accusations and threats, radiating through the screen. I put the phone on silent and walked to Arthur's chair. I sat down in the dark, the boxed-up steak forgotten on the kitchen counter. I had won. I had protected Arthur's legacy and my own dignity. But the price was the final, irrevocable shattering of a family portrait that had been cracked for years. I looked at the portrait of Arthur on the mantel, his kind eyes seeming to watch over me. A single tear finally escaped and traced a path down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but one of overwhelming, heartbreaking gratitude. "Thanks God," I whispered into the quiet of the empty house. "And thank you, Arthur." 2 weeks after the disastrous dinner, I did something I hadn't done in 40 years. I took a trip by myself. I bought a plane ticket, rented a car, and drove north from Minneapolis, watching the city skyline bleed into endless stretches of birch and pine. Following Arthur's meticulous directions, I found a gravel road that ended at a pair of iron gates. Beyond them, nestled in a grove of towering trees, was the house. It wasn't a cabin. It was a work of art, crafted from cedar and stone with a wall of windows that looked out over a vast, shimmering lake. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps echoing in the silence. It was fully furnished in a comfortable, rustic style that was entirely Arthur's taste. He had been building this for us, a secret dream for a future he knew he wouldn't see. On the kitchen island, a welcome basket was waiting for me with a bottle of wine, fresh cheese, and a loaf of bread. Tucked into the cellophane was an envelope. With trembling hands I opened it. It was Arthur's handwriting, a note he must have arranged with a local property manager months ago. Enjoy our new beginning, Carolyn. I love you. The tears I'd held back for weeks finally came. They weren't tears of grief or anger, but of overwhelming love. This wasn't just an asset. It was a sanctuary. Arthur had built me a place to heal. Standing there, watching the sun set over the quiet water, I felt the heavy cloak of being Arthur's widow begin to fall away, replaced by the simple, terrifying, and exhilarating reality of being Carolyn Adler. My peace was shattered a week later by the arrival of a certified letter. The envelope was thick and bore the letterhead of a high-powered Chicago law firm. My stomach clenched. Inside, written in cold, formal language, was a notice that my son, Ethan Adler, and his wife, Jessica, were formally contesting the will of Arthur Adler. The grounds were as absurd as they were insulting. They claimed Arthur was not of sound mind in his final year and that I, his wife of 4 decades, had exerted undue influence over him to secure the entirety of his estate. They were painting me as a predator and their father as a senile old man. A hot, clean anger burned through my veins. This wasn't about grief or family. This was a hostile takeover attempt, stripped of all pretense. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Hayes. I read him the letter, my voice tight but controlled. He was silent for a moment when I finished. "Let them try, Carolyn," he said, his voice a bastion of calm. "They have no idea who they're dealing with. And I don't mean you or me. I mean Arthur. Your husband spent the last 2 years of his life building a legal fortress around you. This lawsuit is a foolish, expensive tantrum, and we are going to treat it as such." His confidence was a bomb, extinguishing my anger and leaving behind a cold, hard resolve. While the lawyers exchanged preliminary filings, Mr. Hayes advised me to continue with my life, and part of that life I was realizing was in Montana. A week later I flew to Bozeman. The sky there was a different entity altogether, a vast, endless blue that humbled everything beneath it. A man who looked like he was carved from the landscape itself was waiting for me at the small airport. He was holding a worn Stetson hat and a sign that read, "Adler." "Bo," he said, extending a calloused hand. His grip was like iron. "I was your husband's foreman. And his friend." He drove me out to the ranch in a dusty Ford pickup. For miles, all I saw was rolling grassland, distant mountains, and cattle that watched us pass with lazy indifference. Bo was a man of few words, but the ones he used had weight. He told me about Arthur's love for the land, his respect for the seasons, his quiet satisfaction in building something real and tangible. "He worried about your boy," Bo said, his eyes on the road. "Ethan came out here once, 5 or 6 years back. Talked about carving up a few hundred acres on the West Ridge to sell for quick turnaround vacation homes. Arthur shut that down fast. Told me later. Some people see a legacy, Bo. Others just see a price tag." As we crested a hill and I saw the ranch sprawling below, a collection of sturdy barns and a simple, beautiful ranch house, I understood. This was another piece of Arthur's soul. "He left a letter with me," Bo said, pulling to a stop. "Said I was to continue managing this place for you if you'd have me. This ranch answers to you now, Mrs. Adler. The men and we're with you." The deposition took place in a sterile conference room in Chicago. The air was thick with tension. Ethan and Jessica sat across the long, polished table with their smug-looking lawyer. Jessica wore a severe designer suit, Ethan a tie that he kept nervously adjusting. They looked like they were there to close a business deal. I, on the other hand, felt remarkably calm. Mr. Hayes sat beside me, a bastion of quiet competence. His files arranged in perfect order. 4 hours, their lawyer peppered me with questions, trying to paint me as a frail, confused woman who couldn't possibly have understood her husband's finances. I answered each question simply, factually, and without emotion. Then it was their turn. Under Mr. Hayes's gentle but relentless questioning, their story unraveled. Their financial desperation became clear. Their claims of wanting to protect me sounded hollow and self-serving. Jessica's composure cracked, her answers growing sharp and defensive. The final blow came when Mr. Hayes turned to their lawyer. To put the issue of my client's competency to rest, he said, I'd like to present Exhibit D. He slid a flash drive across the table. This is a video recording of the will signing, conducted 3 months before Mr. Adler's passing, in the presence of his lead physician. He played it on the large screen in the room. There was Arthur, looking thin but with his eyes sharp and his voice firm, clearly stating his wishes and his absolute faith in my judgment. He looked directly at the camera. Let no one question this, he said. My wife is my legacy. The room fell silent. Ethan stared at the screen, at the ghost of his father, and for the first time, he looked utterly and completely broken. I was back at the lake house when the call came. The late afternoon sun was turning the water to gold. It's over, Carolyn, Mr. Hayes said. There was no elation in his voice, only a deep, professional satisfaction. The judge dismissed their case this morning. With prejudice. What does that mean? I asked, watching a loon dive under the surface of the lake. It means they can't ever bring this suit again. He called their claim frivolous and bordering on harassment. He also granted our motion, so they will be responsible for covering all of our legal fees. A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled my knees washed over me. It was done. The fight was over. I had been tested and I had not broken. There was no joy in the victory, only a quiet finality. Ethan and Jessica, driven by a greed they couldn't afford, had lost everything. Not just a future inheritance, but their dignity and a mountain of money in legal bills. They had severed the last thread connecting them to their father's world. I hung up the phone and stood by the window, looking out at the endless water. The battle was over. The silence that followed was no longer the silence of grief or tension. It was the silence of open space. The silence of a future waiting to be written. And for the first time I was the only one holding the pen. In the months that followed, the silence of my life began to fill with new sounds. I worked with Mr. Hayes to establish the Adler Engineering Scholarship at the State University, a tribute to Arthur's passion. I sat on the selection committee, reading applications from bright, ambitious students who reminded me of a young Arthur. I found myself speaking in meetings, offering opinions, and discovering a voice I hadn't used in years. The gossip among my old social circle, undoubtedly fueled by Jessica, eventually faded into irrelevance. My new friends were the other members of the scholarship board, my neighbors at the lake who knew me simply as Carolyn, and a sharp, funny woman I met in a gardening class. They were people who were interested in my thoughts, not my assets. For the first time I was building a community that was entirely my own, based not on obligation or history, but on mutual respect. The emptiness in my life was receding, replaced by a quiet, steady sense of purpose. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Ethan standing on my porch. I almost didn't recognize him. He was thinner, his expensive suit replaced by a simple jacket and jeans. The arrogance in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, hollowed-out shame. "Mom," he said, his voice raspy. He couldn't quite meet my gaze. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" I led him to the living room but didn't offer him a seat. We stood there in an awkward silence until he finally spoke. "Jessica left me," he said, the words falling flat in the quiet room. "The legal bills. Everything. It all fell apart." He finally looked at me, his eyes pleading. "She was right about one thing. I was a fool. Dad was right about everything. About me." A broken apology followed, rambling and raw. He wasn't making excuses. He was finally, painfully, taking ownership. When he was done, he just stood there expecting nothing. I looked at my son, stripped of all his bluster, and felt a pang of pity, but not enough to erase the wounds. Forgiveness wasn't a gift I could give him. Self-respect was something he had to earn. "What you do now, Ethan, is what matters," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "Get a job. Build a life of your own, one that your father would have been proud of. Maybe then one day we can truly talk." He nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He turned and walked away without another word, leaving me to close the door on a chapter of my life I hoped was finally over. With the drama behind me, I turned my full attention to my inheritance, and for the first time I saw it not as money but as potential. In Montana, I worked with Bo. We didn't sell an inch of land. Instead, we invested. We upgraded the irrigation systems, using new technology to conserve water. We allocated a portion of the profits to improve the living quarters for the ranch hands. I learned about cattle futures and land management, my mind sharp and engaged. The ranch began to thrive, a living testament to Arthur's foresight and my own newfound business acumen. In Minnesota, I had the lake house renovated, adding a new wing with several quiet, comfortable guest suites. I worked with a local grief counseling center to establish Arthur's Overlook, a retreat offering free week-long stays for families who had recently lost a loved one. I wanted others to have the same chance at peace that this place had given me. My wealth was no longer a number in a bank account. It was a thriving business, a scholarship that changed lives, a sanctuary for the grieving. It was a legacy in motion. A year after the lawsuit was dismissed, my life had found a new, fulfilling rhythm. I spent my summers at the lake, my autumns at the ranch, and the rest of the year at my home, managing my projects. I was busy, surrounded by competent allies and good friends. I was happy. One day a postcard arrived in the mail. The picture was of a giant sequoia tree in a national park. I turned it over. The handwriting was Ethan's. "Mom," it read. "I work here now. As a park ranger. It's quiet. The air is clean. I think Dad would have liked it here. Hope you are well." That was all. It wasn't a plea for money or forgiveness. It was just a message from a man who was, perhaps, finally finding his own way. I smiled, a genuine, uncomplicated smile, and placed the postcard on my desk. It was a sign of hope, a seed planted in a distant wilderness that I wished well, but no longer felt the need to tend. I am sitting on the dock of the lake house now, a place that once represented a secret future and now represents my present peace. The sun is setting, painting the water in strokes of orange and deep purple. The air is cool and smells of pine. I think back on the woman I was, the one who sat in Arthur's armchair, drowning in a sea of dying flowers and suffocating sympathy. The painful, fiery journey from there to here was not one I would have chosen, but it was the one I needed. I realize now the ultimate revenge wasn't the confrontation in the restaurant. It was this. It was living well, building something positive and becoming whole. I am filled with a deep, profound gratitude. Not just for the money or the houses, but for Arthur's unwavering faith in me. He didn't just leave me an inheritance. He left me a key. He trusted me to unlock a strength within myself that I never knew I possessed. The last sliver of sun disappears below the horizon, leaving the sky in a soft, contented twilight. My life is my own, and it is a good life. And so, Carolyn's story comes to a close. Thank you for following her journey from a silent widow to the quiet architect of her own legacy. Her ultimate revenge wasn't a single moment of triumph, but the powerful act of building a life filled with purpose. Now, I have one last question for you all, and I truly want to know your opinion. If you were in Carolyn's shoes, would you have picked up the phone after receiving that postcard from Ethan? Comment. Forgive. If you believe the ultimate victory would be to help him and try to rebuild their family. Comment. Forget. If you believe he needed to continue walking his path alone and that protecting her own peace was the right choice. Let me know what you would have done. And thank you again for reading.